Hello and welcome to another of the E-Biology Teacher Podcasts. I'm Mr. Doc, and today it's all about the history of life and how it changes. All right, now this is a pretty complex conversation because um, most of what we know is based on fossil evidence and other scientific endeavors that while we're pretty sure that the data is spot on, there's a lot of it that is still being tested, and there's a lot of it that, quite frankly, there's just no other option to explain it. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go through the modern scientific explanation of sort of the history of life on the planet, and more importantly, how we know it. Okay, so we're not just going to say, all right, here's how old life is. We're going to say, okay, and here's how we came to that conclusion. We're going to talk about certain milestones in a species evolution and how that makes a difference. And we're also going to talk about how entire species change over time and what mechanisms they can do to sort of help that out. So those are the topics of conversation today, and we're going to go ahead and get started by looking at sort of the big picture. A long time ago, the Earth was formed by what we believe is a Big Bang. Basically, this massive interstellar explosion that gave birth to kind of everything in the universe. All right. At our best guess, that's about 4.6 billion with a B, billion years ago. Now, the life forms on the planet Earth, by our best estimates, didn't form until about 700 million years ago. So you can see that the universe and Earth specifically was around for a really long time before life ever kind of appeared on the planet. So the way we know that is that initially at the formation of Earth, life couldn't have existed because the atmosphere was primarily gases that would be toxic to any living thing that we know of, right? So there was no way that the early Earth, we're talking about the Earth 4.6 billion years ago, could have sustained life. Life couldn't have survived at all, much less formed in those conditions. But there was one huge key that made it all possible, and that was that water was present on Earth. Right? Because water is an essential thing to life, and without it, life would not have formed. But because Earth had the unique capacity to have water on it, that made all the difference. Now, there is somebody who can explain this origin story a lot better than I can, and his name's Neil deGrasse Tyson. You may have caught this on Cosmos, which originally aired on the Fox network, a fantastic show. And you really should check out every episode. But I want to show you the analogy that he makes, and he takes this from his mentor, Carl Sagan, to explain kind of how life began. They call it the cosmic calendar. Take a look at this.
The cosmic calendar begins on January 1st with the birth of our universe. It contains everything that's happened since then up to now, which on this calendar is midnight, December 31st. On this scale, every month represents about 1 billion years. Every day represents nearly 40 million years. Let's go back as far as we can to the very first moment of the universe. January 1st, the Big Bang. It's as far back as we can see in time. For now.
I got to tell you, the guy's a really good storyteller. All right. So that's what we know. And the math that he mentioned there does give you some numbers. You're like, hold on, wait a minute. I thought he said, remember, I didn't talk about the universe. I talked about Earth. We suggest that Earth is about 4.6 billion years ago, and life is about 700 million years old. And by the way, if you're really interested in this topic, Cosmos is a great show to check out because they do a lot more detailed explanation about that. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about our next topic. So how do we know? How do we know how old life is and all that stuff? Well, there are a couple of different ways. First off, when an organism dies, if the conditions are right, the remains can be fossilized or preserved, in some cases for millions and millions and millions of years. Um, our first known fossil is only about 700 million years, and even that one, I mean, even those are estimated. So how do we know how old they are? I mean, we weren't there. Nobody was back 700 million years ago, writing sample dates on the specimens. So there are two major ways that we use, or that we, two major methods that we use to determine age of fossils. The first is called relative dating. And of course, there's going to be some sort of, West Virginia dating your relatives joke here, so feel free. And then we have radioactive dating. Now, relative dating is used to determine the age of something by saying, where in the layers of rock is it? The lower something is in the layers of rock, the older that it is. So more modern specimens are going to be way up here at the top, and more ancient specimens are going to be way down here at the bottom. Radioactive dating, on the other hand, uses the natural process of radioactive decay, typically of carbon, which we should already know is the organic compound that makes up life, or the organic element, I should say. And it decays at a specific or a certain rate. So if we can take a specimen and we can see how much of the decayed material there is, and we know how fast that decays, we should be able to determine with relative certainty how old something is. So let's take a look at those in a bit more detail. Relative dating takes into account that rock layers form over time. So if we look here, you see all of these different layers of rock. The lower the layer of rock, the older it's going to be, because the rock forms and then we build another layer on top and another layer on top and another layer on top. That's how it happened. So if we looked at the specimens way, 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 way down in the lower strata of that, the strata or layers, then those are going to be the oldest. And then if we look into account and say, well, how do we know how long those layers form? Well, we know roughly how long it took certain layers to form. We know that process through geology. So we can really tell by basically subtracting how old something is. All right, and that's the first thing, especially with fossils. Now we have come a long way, and the science and the technology have really allowed us to do some really cool things, which is where radioactive dating comes into play. Basically, with radioactive dating, we take a specimen and we say, okay, it has a certain amount of, let's say, carbon in it. All right. Well, carbon has what we call a half-life, meaning that that's the amount of time it takes for half of whatever you've got to decay, right? And then after another half-life, let's say roughly 5,300 years, half of that specimen will decay, and half of that specimen will. Well, when it decays into something predictable. We know that when carbon decays, it decays into another substance. Well, if we can compare how much carbon we've got to how much decayed material we have, all we basically have to do is add those half-lives together, right? So, for example, let's say that the half-life of carbon is roughly 5,300 years, and we have a quarter of the specimen left. In other words, 3/4 of the specimen has decayed. Well, that specimen is roughly 10,600 years old, because that carbon has decayed. The first half-life was 5,300 years. The second half-life was another 5,300 years. So if there was half of it left, it would have been 5,300. And if there was a quarter, then it would be another 5,300. Now, if there was an eighth of that specimen left, then we're talking about 15,900, roughly. Okay, so that's how that works. So you can see that while relative dating really puts things into perspective with other specimens, so evolutionarily speaking, which is really what we're going to concentrate on, you can see where all this stuff happened. Radioactive dating can give us a more quantifiable or a more almost a more certain number. So let's talk about what had to happen for all of this to start. Well, as conditions on the Earth started to settle after the Big Bang that Dr. Tyson talked about, it's believed that life developed originally from these small organic particles that we learned about when we talked about Operin and Miller and Urey, where the right amount of electricity and the right amount of inorganic compounds were able to form these organic compounds. And so it's believed that those were able to work together symbiotically to perform or to form very rudimentary, very simple single-celled organisms that would be prokaryotes. All right. Now, bacteria, obviously, we're talking about prokaryotes, are thought to be the first organisms to evolve on the planet. And of course, if they're alive, they're going to need energy. So they had to be autotrophic. They had to be able to fend for themselves energy-wise. So through millions of years of these single-celled prokaryotes, sort of going through the process of what we can best describe as photosynthesis or chemiosynthesis, they started producing a lot of oxygen, which started to change the composition of the atmosphere. That means that due to millions of years of producers only, that's all that was on the planet, oxygen started to build up in the atmosphere. Now, the evidence that we have to suggest that is that there are different species now that have evolved to where oxygen for these bacteria is toxic, right? So getting rid of it would obviously make sense. So we see that those organisms now live in areas on the planet where oxygen is very, very scant, not a lot of it. But what is key to note here is that these tiny little cells change the world. I mean, they change the composition of the atmosphere, which set the conditions right for more complex heterotrophs to form, right? So without these millions and millions of years of these simple single-celled organisms kind of doing their thing, the bigger, more complex, more multicellular organisms never would have had the opportunity to form in the first place, right? So that's something that I think we got to get our head around. Now, it is also important to note that stuff happens, right? During the process of life, throughout time, we're going to have these rises and falls and rises and falls. And before I go there, I want to introduce a topic, and I know this isn't on the objectives, but the current prevailing theory is something that we call the endosymbiotic theory, and here's what this suggests. Because if you're like me, right now you're going, okay, he told me how single-celled organisms form, but he didn't tell me how multicellular organisms form. It's typically believed that as the bacteria, these rudimentary bacteria that were surviving on the planet, work together, it's possible that some of the bacteria consumed others, but didn't digest them. So what happened is the bacteria that got consumed is inside the other cell, working. Right? Endo, inside, symbiosis, that long-term relationship. So that would have given rise to more complex organisms like eukaryotes. Now, we're still talking about single-cellular because it's one cell eating another cell. But then what happened is as they worked together, they started to form these long-term relationships and started to share DNA. And that's generally how we believe that this happened. And you may start even going, well, how is that possible that we go from single cell to like dinosaur, which you see on the screen? Well, keep in mind, Darwin said unimaginable tracts of time. Okay, we're not talking about something that happened over a couple of years. We're talking about something that happened over a couple of million years or a couple of 100 million years, right? So what we know, at least from our studies in ecology and we've already studied about evolution, is that the environment makes a huge difference. So throughout time, events change the environment, which guides how species change. At the end of the Jurassic period, for example, it's believed that an ice age was caused by an asteroid striking the Earth. Now, this always confused me. How can an asteroid, big burning ball, flame coming from the sky, right, create an ice age? Well, when it hit, like a baseball on a baseball field, if it drops in the dirt, it's going to kick up some dust, right? Well, imagine a baseball the size of, I don't know, Texas, right? That's going to That's going to kick up a lot of dirt, which is then going to block out the sun. And as we know, producers need the sun. So if they're not around, then we don't have anything to eat, and things get hairy pretty quick. Also, it traps out the heat of the sun, which means that everything under this big dust cloud is going to get really cold, right? This is an example of what we call a mass extinction event. Only a few organisms are believed to survive that event due to their ability to adapt to the new conditions. And we've talked about adaptation already. If you were able to adapt, now the world is your oyster. No pun intended, but basically there's no competition now. All the things that you were competing against and a large portion of the things that were eating you are probably gone now. So basically it was an evolutionary reset button, right? And so that is widely believed to be how the dinosaurs went extinct, right? And so that would explain how we start missing these organisms. Well, where did they go? Well, a mass extinction event could have occurred and sent them all the way of Old Yeller, right? So how are the ways, or what are the ways that species can change? Well, when a species, and in some cases entire communities, respond to environmental pressures, it's called macroevolution. These are the big evolutions that occur. There are 5 ways, really, that this occurs, and some of them we even combine together. The first is extinction, and we've talked about that before, because remember, if the environment changes, you can migrate, you can adapt, or you can die. It's your choice. I would prefer one of the first 2. But anyway, the 5 main ways are extinction, adaptive radiation or divergent evolution, convergent evolution, and co-evolution. All right, and so let's talk about each one of those. Extinction is pretty self-explanatory. Extinction is the end of a species. It's the functional end of a species. Now, causes for this can be mass extinction events, like the Jurassic extinction of the dinosaurs. Targeted environmental changes can occur, meaning that the environment changes, and there's just one thing that you can't deal with, right? Everybody else is fine, but that one little thing messes with you, and it's over, right? The lack of genetic variation can certainly contribute to extinction. Keep in mind that the more variations you have, the more likely that one of those variations may provide for your survival. So if you don't have a lot of variations, you don't have a lot of options, right? And that can contribute to the last point, and that is if you don't have the ability to adapt and you don't have the ability to migrate, then if the environment changes, you're left with one option. Sorry. Bye-bye. Right? And that's the way it works. Now, another way that a species can evolve is called adaptive radiation, which is similar to, or basically the same thing as, divergent evolution. Divergent. All right, di means to split or to, right? When species can change, not all populations will necessarily respond in the same way, right? So if a species is going to change, there may be 2 populations of the exact same species that are exposed to different pressures. Well, that means that the adaptations in species A are going to be different than the adaptations in species B because they're under different conditions. So when different populations of the same species evolve in different ways in response to either different pressures or different conditions, it's called adaptive radiation or divergent evolution. In other words, this same species splits into 2. Divergent, they diverge, right? As populations become more and more different, as those differences start to accumulate, they get to the point where they're so different that they can no longer mate. And if that happens, you have what's called speciation. All right, speciation is how new species are formed. Now, there are a couple of different ways that this can happen. A lot of times, it's geographic, right? You have a population here, you have a population here, and somehow there's something splitting them in the middle. This is called by the allopatric speciation, where because of this physical barrier, this population over here is responding in this way, and this population is completely different conditions. They're gonna split in different ways, right? So now what happens is you end up with 2 species that are different. The reason why we call this adaptive radiation is because as the species splits, each one of those new species adapt in their own way. Probably the best example of this would be Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands, because what he saw was there had to be this common ancestor, and that each population that split off of that common ancestor really was adapting to the food source, right? So you had those that had really thin, pointy beaks. Those are the ones that were probably evolving to eat bugs, and then the ones with the big honking beaks, like that guy behind me, which is not a finch, by the way, were probably cracking nuts, right? And the other ones that had sort of the stronger, sort of grinding beaks were good at eating seeds. So they were all sort of adapting to the different conditions in which they live, so they radiated into all these different species. So divergent is where one species, one population splits and adapts separately and becomes more and more different. They diverge from each other. Now, the opposite of this would be convergent evolution. Now, if divergent means to separate, then convergent means to come together, right? There are some factors that can take seemingly unrelated species and make them more and more and more alike, right? So if different species are exposed to the same environmental pressures, then they're going to start resembling each other, right? Probably the best example of this is shown on the screen there, and those are placental versus marsupial mammals. You may not know this, but Australia is a lot like Northern California, okay, in terms of the environment, which explains, by the way, why the wine industry in Australia is booming. Everybody knows they make good wine in California, so we put some grapes over there in Australia. They're growing grapes and making wine. Woo, right? But if we look at the animals, like the mole and the marsupial mole, they really look a lot alike. But this mole here has more in common with a mouse, and this mole over here has more in common with like a koala because it's marsupial, right? But why would they look so much alike? Because they're exposed to the same environmental pressures, right? Now, I have a live example of this, and normally I don't like to do a show with live animals, but I think this one's important. This little person here is habanero, right? She is a sugar glider, right? She's cute. Hello, come on out, right? Come see your friends, right? Now, you may look at her and go, oh, flying squirrel. She's a rodent. Nope, she's a marsupial, right? Habanero is more closely related to a kangaroo than she's a squirrel, right? Which gets us into why common names are a bad idea, right? Come here, darling. Hold on one second. Let's see if I can get her out so you can see her for real. Now, up there she is. Woohoo! There's my girl. Now, again, she has more in common with the kangaroo than she does with the mouse, right? Or the squirrel that gives her sort of name. So the question is, why is that the case? Why is she that way? Well, she was exposed to similar environmental pressures that our squirrels were, right? So they look alike and they act alike, right? Now, there is something that's interesting, a sort of side note about these guys, right? If we look at the sugar glider, oop, there she is. You see these little tail that's going to help her balance on trees, and you see these little flaps right next to her arms that allows her to glide. Well, why would that be an advantage, right? Well, they call them sugar gliders because they like to eat fruit, right? They like to eat fruit from trees. So being able to jump from tree to tree without getting on the ground where her predators are was a selective advantage, right? So now that's why this species looks the way they do, all right? All right, let's go into our home. All right, there you go. So that is convergent evolution, becoming more and more alike even though you're technically different, right? Scene. All right, let's continue on. I'm just hoping she doesn't run away. There is one other option here, and that is, what if the species that you have a relationship with evolves, right? Well, then you got to evolve, or you got to die, right? There are organisms, and we learned this in ecology, that are so important that they ultimately determine a species' survival. Well, if one species evolves in the relationship, then the other's going to have to keep up. Now, there are a whole bunch of examples of this. Probably the best one that I can, or probably the coolest one I can think of is the one on the screen there. That is called a hammerhead orchid, that flower, right? And if you look at that, that's an ugly flower. And we know that typically the flowers are going to be pretty to attract pollinators. But that wasp there does not think that that flower is ugly. As a matter of fact, that wasp thinks that flower looks like a lady wasp. Yeah, right? So what's going to happen is when those hammerhead orchids bloom, the male wasps are flying around going, ooh, look, a lady, I'm going to go introduce myself. Well, when the fly introduces himself, the hammerhead orchid flips up, and you can see this little thing right here. It flips him up and sticks pollen on his back. So he'll go kind of do a 180 and get pollen on him. Why in the world would a flower want to look like a wasp? Because it wants to be pollinated by a wasp. So when this guy realizes, oh, you're not a lady, you're a flower, he is going to go to another flower, and it's going to happen again, and he's going to drop off that pollen, and boom, we have more hammerhead orchids, right? That's pretty cool, right? So that's coevolution. Now here's another example. Newts, little salamanders, and I don't have one of them, are probably the most poisonous organism on the planet. Their toxin, just a little bit that would fit on the head of a pin, could kill a full-grown human, right? There's no reason why that would need to be the case. They are herbivores, right? But there's one organism that has a pretty good resistance to that toxin, and it's the almost harmless garter snake, right? And here's why. The newt has a poison, and the garter snake has some immunity to it. So when a snake eats a newt, then the poison doesn't affect him, then it's no big deal. So the newt's poison, those with really, really high levels of poison, were able to prevent being eaten, right? They were able to kill the snake. So that means that only those species, only those individuals that had the more toxic level of poison were going to survive. Well, that means that the only snakes that could survive were the ones that were having just a little bit more resistance to that toxin. Well, then the newts had to evolve up and go, okay, well, the ones that are a little more toxic are going to survive. The ones with a little more resistance are going to survive. And over time, we have this escalation, this building and building of, I'm going to evolve, and then you're going to evolve, and then I'm going to evolve, and then you're going to evolve. There are many, many examples where one species and another species fit like a lock to a key, and we go, okay, well, those had to be very similar, right? Now, the last thing we want to mention here is what we call punctuated equilibrium versus gradualism. So now we know that species can either go extinct, they can adaptively radiate, meaning they become more and more different through divergent evolution. They can converge, they become more and more similar because the environmental pressures are the same. Or in some cases, they just kind of evolve step by step together. The question is, how does this happen? Well, there are two real ways. For the most part, life goes unchanged unless something else changes, right? So if we look at evolution on the grand scheme of things, it would seem that evolution happens through a process called gradualism, meaning that these little changes over time start to shift the balance, and we start to see these slight changes that become more impactful as we go up the tree. The other option is that certain things happen during equilibrium that cause a branch, right? And we call that punctuated equilibrium. So the difference between gradualism and punctuated equilibrium is pretty simple. Gradualism suggests that little bitty changes over time kind of accumulate to the point where we gradually get more and more and more different. Punctuated equilibrium says that we go through this period of pretty much non-change until something in the environment happens, and then we have a branching event. We have an event that says, okay, something's got to give here, and then we're going to split, and we're going to go our separate ways. And that's really what punctuated equilibrium is. All right. hopefully we understand a little bit about the history of life and how it changes. Let's go over our objectives and see if we've done that. We want to describe the scientific theory of how life began on the planet. We start really with the Big Bang. Earth forms about 4.6 billion years ago. Life started forming in the very simple prokaryotic forms about 700 million years ago. And we know this using things like relative dating and radioactive dating, which is basically looking at any preserved evidence of life, which we call a fossil, and saying, okay, here's our estimation. In terms of milestone of species, keep in mind that species typically go unchanged unless their environment changes, and then they have the option to migrate, adapt, or die. And then if a species is going to change, they can become different because they're exposed to different pressures. Species in the same area can become more alike, even if they're unrelated, due to convergent evolution. Or species that depend on each other can often co-evolve, meaning they evolve together so that they can maintain their relationship. And then explain how characteristics of an entire species can change over time. Keep in mind that little changes is called gradualism, and that can certainly occur. But there can also be these qualifying events where we end up going, okay, bam, something happened. Something big happened, and that made a big change. And that's called punctuated equilibrium. I hope this helped you understand a little bit about where we came from. And truth be told, it should help us understand a little bit about where we're going. There's tons of information on MrDocsOnlineLab.com, and I hope I get to see you here again sometime soon. Bye.